Hey guys, today's episode is going to be about a very well-known serial killer named John Wayne Gacy. I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard of him. This guy was truly a sick individual, and he's believed to have raped, murdered, and tortured at least 33 young men and boys. There is currently a documentary on Netflix that's called Conversations with the Killer, the John Wayne Gacy Tapes. And in this documentary, there is so much shocking information that I hadn't even heard about before, and I've known about this case for years. So let's dive right in. Before we get started, we just wanted to say really quick that we are so thankful for those of you who have been listening and supporting our podcast. It just means so much to us, and we really do appreciate you. So John Wayne Gacy was born March 17th, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois, which is actually where Lexi and I are from. We're from a suburb of Chicago. John had two sisters, and he was the only son to John and Marion Gacy. John was pretty close with his mom, and his sisters, but didn't have a great relationship with his dad. His dad was actually an alcoholic, and he was pretty abusive to his family. John was both physically and verbally abused by his dad growing up, and when his mom would try and step in, his dad would call him names like mama's boy or sissy. Despite this, though, John really loved his father. He just never really felt good enough. On top of that, John started to have homosexual urges that he knew his father would definitely not approve of. So his childhood wasn't the best. John eventually went on to college and worked as a salesman for a shoe company, which is where he met Marlon Myers. They eventually got engaged, and then they married in 1964. The couple moved to Waterloo, Iowa, to manage KFC restaurants owned by Marlon's father. Later on, they welcomed two kids, a son in 1966 and a daughter in 1967. John's life at this point seemed good, and he seemed happy. John was an aspiring politician, and he was a part of the local JCs, which is an organization for younger people to develop leadership skills through public service and charity work. And John was very involved in this organization and was looked up to by others in the group. He even served on the board of directors. One of the things John did was perform as Pogo the Clown or Patches the Clown at children's hospitals and charity events. And this is where the Killer Clown nickname would later come from. So doing these charity events, John came across as very kind and very friendly, and people really liked him. So when a boy named Donald Voorhees Jr. had told his father John sexually assaulted him, people couldn't believe it. And as it turns out, John didn't just sexually abuse Donald, he abused many other teenage boys as well. John would trick boys into believing that they had to participate in sex acts with him for homosexual research purposes, and he would pay them for it. Other times he would give them alcohol and make advances towards them, and if they freaked out, he would just say, "Oh, I'm just kidding, it's just a joke, I'm just testing you." So this had been happening for a while, but with Donald, he just happened to get caught. Of course, when Donald's father heard this, he called police, and John was later arrested. He was eventually charged and convicted of sodomy and sentenced to 10 years in prison, but he would only actually serve 18 months. And it was at this point that John's wife became disgusted and divorced him. So John got out after 18 months, but he was on parole. He moved back to Chicago and got remarried, and then started a construction business called PDM. For his business, of course, John liked to hire young men for jobs. He continued to have these homosexual urges, but now he took those urges even further. John would lure victims to his house with promises of potential work, drugs, or money for sex. Once he got them into his home, he would first gain their trust, and once he had that, he would show them a magic trick, as he called it. And this magic trick would involve putting his victims in handcuffs. This, of course, would restrain his victims so that he could then go on to rape and torture them. The things he would do to his victims are awful, and it was even said that some of the victims just begged to die instead of enduring any more of his torture. John killed his victims by strangling them with a rope around their neck and suffocating them with gags. He then would bury his victims in his crawl space. So now that we gave a little bit of an overview, let's talk about the documentary. Okay, so Lex, what did you think of the documentary?
I thought it was so creepy. Like you said, I've known about this case for a while too, but after watching the documentary, I feel like I learned a couple more things that I had no idea about. But it's so creepy to like kind of get inside his head and like think about how just sick he was.
And listening to him on the tapes just was
he kind of like, to me, he sounds like so like it's not a big deal to me. Like he just sounds, I don't know, like he's just having a conversation.
Like no remorse at all.
Exactly. But going back to like some of the things we learned in the documentary, one thing that stood out to me and was like just super chilling was the account by Steve Nemmers, who was a former like acquaintance of John Wayne Gacy. He had only met him once, and it was at this time that this event happened. But basically, Steve had two friends who, I think one of them needed to go pick up a check at the KFC, which obviously is where John was working. And that's when they went to pick that up. He had met John Wayne Gacy there. And Gacy said, you know, hey, like my wife and children, they're out of town. Why don't you guys come over? We can play pool and, you know, just have a night of drinks and stuff like that. So the three of them headed over, and you know, the night went on. They played pool and stuff like that. And then the two friends of Steve talked about a party the next day and suggested that Steve should just stay back the night and just, you know, spend the night at John's house. So Steve ended up spending the night, but in the documentary, he said that he didn't really want to stay. You know, he had just met the guy and stuff like that. But he ended up just thinking to himself, you know, it's better than driving with two guys who are, you know, clearly drunk, so I'll just stay. It's fine. And then as the night went on, a series of events happened. John actually put on what was called at the time a stag film, which is basically just pornography, and kind of forced him to watch, and then even said, like, we're going to perform sex acts on each other.
And he held him at like gunpoint.
Yeah, he held him at gunpoint at one point. And this guy, obviously, he was 18 years old at the time. He started crying, and he said that John was actually laughing at him while he was crying and saying that he really liked to see how far he can push somebody psychologically, and that he just found it funny. And he ended up stopping. And then when they went to sleep that night, he woke up with him touching him and having him at knife point. And the same type of stuff. He was laughing at him, crying. He was saying, you know, we're going to do this. We're going to continue what we were doing downstairs. And this poor guy at 18 years old is, you know, obviously freaking out. But yeah.
And he said he didn't go back to sleep.
No,
he sat
didn't.
up until
until I think
morning.
It was like 6 or 7 in the morning. And then he was like, you know, we need to leave. Like, let's go. And they, you know, just began driving. And that was his account. You know, it was very scary for him being 18 years old. And this is back in, I don't know if I said the date, but this is back in 67. So this is actually before his arrest for sodomy, which was in 68. Right. So it was a long time ago. He was young.
Yeah. It was so sad listening to his account and what he said, and you could see it in his face, just like remembering all the things that he went through. He just
at one point he was even like choked up about it, and he was like, I was 18 years old. Like, what 18-year-old wants to go to the police? An 18-year-old man in that time wants to go to the police and tell the police that kind of stuff.
Yeah, like he was ashamed.
Yeah, because it's like at that time it was stuff like that was just not talked about. So for another man to say another man did this to him, it's not something an 18-year-old wants to go tell the police. So
he was ashamed, he just never and embarrassed, and he kept it bottled up all that time.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So at that point, John did not get caught, but like I said before, a year later, he did get caught when Donald Voorhees Jr. told his dad that he had been sexually assaulted, and John did get charged and convicted of sodomy, and he did spend time in jail, although he got out after 18 months only.
Which is so insane, because it's like, he was sentenced to 10 years and only served 18 months. Like, that's just nothing.
And if he had stayed there, would this all have happened?
Right. Or would it have just happened when he got out after 10 years? You know, I mean, you never know, but it's scary.
Yeah. So we know that when he got out of jail, he went on to continue his crimes, and he not only raped many more young boys, he also murdered many of them.
Yeah, and actually one of the victims they really focused on in the documentary was Robert Piest, which was one of Gacy's victims, and he was actually the one who led to Gacy's arrest. So they really, really focused on him in this Netflix documentary.
Yeah, he actually worked at a drugstore, and he was seen leaving with John Gacy to talk about a potential job. You know, John had the construction business, and he was always hiring young men for jobs, and he was promised possibly some work, so he went to talk to him. And that's how they knew that he was the last person to see Robert alive.
Yep.
So Robert's missing. His family reported him missing to the police, and with this information, the John is on the police's radar.
Right.
So the police are now questioning John and monitoring him, surveilling him.
Yeah, they actually said they surveilled him 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And obviously he had that previous sodomy charge. So they when they found that out, he was really on their radar.
Right. They were super suspicious of him. And John was getting super cocky with these police officers. He was just messing with them. He would know that they'd be following him, and he would drive super fast or crazy.
Yeah.
And the police, would have to still tail him and be behind him, and they didn't want to arrest him or anything or give him a ticket because they wanted to continue to watch him.
Right, and even to a point where he was so arrogant that he actually invited them into his home. He was
for
why
coffee.
don't you guys come in for coffee, because you're watching me. So, he knew, but he was just so arrogant that, he really thought he could say that.
Yeah.
So during this time of surveilling him, they were able to get 2 search warrants. The first one is where they started with just looking around the house, and they weren't able to find anything. They saw the crawl space, which later we know is where the bodies were buried. Someone even went down there, but they were looking for what they described as mounds of, dirt or whatever was down there, and they didn't see that, so they felt that there was, really nothing down there, so they didn't find anything with that first search warrant. So going back to when I said that he was super arrogant, one of the times that John actually invited the police in for coffee, the cops had already spoken to another missing boy's mother, John Six, I believe his last name is, and that mother told cops that a TV was missing from his home. So cops took the opportunity to have coffee with Gacy because they wanted to see around the house if they could find the same description of the TV. So they went in, they were having coffee with him. The one cop said, I need to go to the bathroom. So he went and he looked around the house. He did not find the TV, but obviously he went into the bathroom and he just flushed the toilet to make it look real. And at that same time, the heat kicked on, and he, being a cop, he knew what dead bodies smelled like and flesh smelled like.
Yeah.
And he said that it was so bad.
He said he knew immediately.
Yeah, he knew immediately. But again, they didn't have a search warrant at that time. They were just having coffee with Gacy. So he came out. They ended up leaving. He told the other cop, obviously, and then that sent them on getting things to get a second search warrant because they already had searched the property once. So it was kind of a little bit difficult to get a second search warrant.
Yeah, they needed something else.
Right, exactly. So going into finding things to get a second search warrant, they actually found a receipt in Gacy's garbage, which was a photo receipt. And Kim, which was Robert Piest's best friend, had told police that she put that receipt in Rob's coat pocket. She explained that she kind of had just an inkling to put it in his pocket for some reason instead of throwing it out. So that actually made it clear that Robert Piest had actually been in Gacy's residence because it was in Gacy's trash. So that was enough for them to get a second search warrant. So this was actually the search warrant where they found everything. They went in and they found multiple remains of young boys and young men in his crawl space, and it was just horrific. They found so much.
So John eventually confessed, and he was charged with 33 murders. And not only were some of these bodies in his crawl space, he also admitted to dumping some in the Des Plaines River as well.
Yeah, and I think it's super creepy. For those of you who haven't watched the documentary, in the documentary they actually said that John was at some point with his attorney and he, showed him a picture of Robert Piest, and Gacy pointed to the picture and he was like, that boy's dead. And he went on to just admit everything, and
like in detail.
Yeah, and like the attorney, of course, is not a police officer. Like he can't arrest him. So that poor attorney was
and
like,
there's like confidentiality between them. So
right, exactly. So he said like he felt disgusting. Like he went home. Like he even said he showered because he felt like physically disgusting, like just gross with all of that information on him. So that's just super. That goes to show you how arrogant he really was, because he probably knew that that guy couldn't do anything. So he's like, well, I'm going to tell you. I'm going to get it off my chest.
So he went to trial, and he was eventually found guilty of 33 charges of murder, and he was sentenced to death. And on May 9th, 1994, he was executed by lethal injection, and his final words were reported to be, "Kiss my ass."
So, just goes to show you how arrogant he was.
Till the end.
No remorse.
Yeah. He seriously is one of the sickest individuals I have ever read about. And this documentary, I couldn't believe some of the information I learned. Like, I didn't know half of this stuff.
Yeah, and HBO Max, if you're looking to watch Gacy documentaries, HBO Max actually has a really good one too. I forgot what it was called, but there's one on there too where it's actually like recordings of talking to Gacy. He's just a really creepy individual. He just seems so nonchalant about the whole thing. And I know we've seen this with a lot of criminals where they seem nonchalant, but I don't know, something about him. He has just like a blank stare when he's talking about it. Doesn't show, even to the end, doesn't show any remorse.
And it's just so crazy how he had everybody fooled. Like, everybody liked him. Everybody looked up to him.
I mean, he was a clown for kids.
Yeah, like they just thought he was so great. And it's amazing how fooled he had everyone.
Yep.
And it just goes to show you never really know someone.
You really don't.
So those are our thoughts on the documentary. If you guys have a chance to check it out, definitely do. It was very interesting.
Yeah, and I just remembered the one on HBO Max is actually called Devil in Disguise. So definitely check that one out too, because that one's super interesting as well. You actually get to see Gacy in that one.
Yeah, I'll have to check it out too, because I haven't heard of that one. But that's all we have for you guys today. There will not be an episode next week. I'm actually going on vacation. I'm taking my family to Disney World. So we're super excited about that. So we won't be here next week, but we will be back the following week with another case. So until then, everyone, stay safe and have a great weekend.